Throughout the centuries, there were many queens who had their lives cut short through ill health. Some of these women were consorts considered answerable to their husbands, and they had little power, but some women ruled in their own right. They were all given relatively good burials, and many were interred inside of Westminster Abbey, in the heart of English religion. But many of these women had their coffins broken into or their burial vaults raided, and some were subjected to terrible treatment after their deaths. This is the opening of the coffins of the Queens of England. Inside of Westminster Abbey, for over 400 years, a Queen of England was left unburied. Royal burials were usually huge, spectacular events. For example, the funeral of Elizabeth I, which brought an end to the Tudor period, was huge and incredible. Henry VIII's funeral, for example, even had to see roads being widened for it to pass by, and he would then be buried inside of St George's Chapel in Windsor Castle. Henry VIII wanted to be interred in a huge tomb, but this would never happen, as the tomb was never finished by his children following his death. But Henry VIII's great-grandmother would be subjected to a harrowing afterlife in which her corpse and remains were treated terribly after her death. Catherine of Valois is remembered today for being the Queen of England, who was left unburied for 400 years inside of Westminster Abbey. But what is the story of her harrowing treatment? Catherine of Valois was the queen and wife of Henry V of England, the warrior king who was said to have been one of the greatest to ever rule over the nation. Henry won spectacular victories against the French at the Battle of Agincourt during the 100 Years' War, but negotiations occurred to marry the English king to Catherine, who was a French princess, and the plan was to combine the two thrones of England and France, with the future children and heirs being the king of both nations. But when Catherine was pregnant with her second child, her husband, Henry V, became very ill, and he was sick. At this time, Catherine was just 21 in a foreign country, and she was now a dowager queen and was the mother of King of England and France, Henry VI. Catherine was now a wanted woman, and she was seen as a possible wife for many nobles because they wanted to be the power behind the King of England, the child of Catherine. But she did have a relationship with Owen Tudor, the keeper of her wardrobe, and they later got married and they had many children. It was this that gave the Tudor family the links to the throne that they would later exploit. However, on the 3rd of February 1437, after giving birth, Catherine of Valois died. She passed away from complications from childbirth, and she'd been ill for a while and had even gone to Bermondsey Abbey for prayer and possible treatment. But Catherine was given a huge funeral, despite the scandal with her marriage, and she was embalmed and her internal organs were removed after death to prevent decay, and then her chest cavity was stuffed with spices and herbs. Catherine's body was then wrapped in a thick and heavy material cerecloth, which was dipped in wax, and her body was then encased in lead before it was placed into a wooden coffin. The organs of Catherine were removed and they were then placed inside of different jars and boxes, and they were buried in different locations to the rest of her body. During the funeral procession, an effigy showing Catherine of Valois was placed on top of the coffin, and it showed the Dowager Queen dressed in her fine clothes, and this was painted to look as realistic as possible, and it shows Catherine as a tall woman with blue-grey eyes. The wooden effigy was, for many, the first time they'd seen any image of the Queen and former wife of Henry V. But Catherine was then given a second funeral service on the 8th of February 1437, 5 days after her death, and she was laid to rest in an alabaster tomb in Westminster Abbey, close to the tomb of her husband, Henry V. Now this could have been the end of Catherine of Valois' story and account in the history books. However, she would then, for the next few centuries, be subjected to a horrific ordeal. The tomb she was placed in was temporary, as Henry VI, her son, wanted to make a huge memorial for her, but he died before this could occur, and Henry VI had also been deposed during the Wars of the Roses. But Henry VII, Catherine's grandson, would then demolish the old lady chapel where she was buried, and he planned to build a new one which would become a big Tudor mausoleum. However, during the work, the tomb of Catherine was destroyed, and Catherine of Valois' body was unearthed as new foundations of the chapel were dug up. Catherine's wooden coffin, which had been interred below ground for around 50 to 60 years, had been decaying, and the wood had rotted a lot. Her remains were then taken out of the coffin, with the coffin being opened, and they were even taken from the lead-lined inner coffin. Her remains were then placed into a wooden chest, which was then covered over roughly with lead from the old roof of the chapel. This new coffin or box, containing the former queen's remains, was then laid near to the feet of her husband's tomb, and it would be left there unburied for around 300 to 400 years. Henry VII may have ordered this to distance himself from his relatives and Catherine's scandalous marriage to Owen Tudor. He said that, "In our monastery at Westminster rests our noble progenitors and blood, and specially the body of our great dame of right noble memory, Queen Catherine, wife to King Henry V. Our body therefore to be buried within the same monastery, that is to say, in the chapel where our said great dame lay buried." It seems he envisioned the Lady Chapel as a family tomb for all the Tudors. But Henry VII died before the Lady Chapel could be finished, and his successor, the infamous six-wived king Henry VIII, did not bury his great-grandmother Catherine of Valois. Neither did any of the other Tudors. The chest she was put inside of had a lid in 2 parts, and people would be shown her remains if they paid a small fee, and tourists came into Westminster Abbey and even pulled back the cerecloth showing her face. It was said that the bones being firmly united and thinly clothed with flesh, like scrapings of tanned leather, and visitors to the abbey said she had bare skin and was buried naked with no clothes, except for her cerecloth shroud. Some tour guides even made money from this, and Catherine of Valois was becoming a morbid tourist attraction. Lots of people who witnessed her body would go further, though, and they would flock to Westminster Abbey to even touch and at times kiss her body. The famous London writer and diarist Samuel Pepys even kissed her corpse, and he wrote on this: "On Shrove Tuesday, 1669, I to the Abbey went, and by favour did see the body of Queen Catherine of Valois, and had the upper part of the body in my hands, and I did kiss her mouth, reflecting upon it, I did kiss a queen. And this my birthday, I 36 years old, and I did kiss a queen." So people would flock to the abbey to kiss the corpse of the queen, and this became a tradition. But there was much more further horrific actions taken against her life, and it was said in the 18th century that her body had been ripped to pieces by a group of young scholars. It was said the queen's body was a shapeless mass of whitish colour, and it had much stolen from it. People had taken her teeth, and some of her bones would later be taken. However, in 1788, the remains were placed inside of a vault for around 100 years. But then during the reign of Queen Victoria, her vault was opened and people broke in to see if her body was really there in the Villiers vault. But they found the remains of her on top of a pile of coffins, and the wooden coffin of Catherine of Valois had been placed inside of, yet again rotted, and it was in a bad way. It had stuck to another coffin, and the people managed to free it, but when it came out into the air, the wood perished. However, when Catherine's body was looked at again, there was a lot missing. Some said it had been covered in lime and several parts of it had decayed, and the front part of her skull had gone missing, and one part of the back of this was found lying on her pelvis. A lot of her backbones had been stolen, as were all her ribs but one, along with 2 of her arm bones. Souvenir hunters had taken a lot of her remains, and her legs were found in perfect condition, still wrapped in the 12 layers of cerecloth which preserved them hundreds of years later. The coffin was replaced, and her remains were then placed into it. A witness who saw it being carried into Henry V's chapel said, "It was a striking and impressive scene, which I shall ever remember, and which at the time it was impossible to view without some feeling of emotion. The daylight had quite faded, and we were alone in the darkened abbey. 2 workmen took up the box containing the Queen's remains and followed Mr. Paul and the clerk of the works, the latter carrying in his hands one small lantern to light us, led us way out of St. Nicholas's Chapel to the north side of the Chantry Chapel. Mr. George Scarfe and myself followed. No one else was present, and we seemed unconsciously and silently to fall into a sort of processional order. I remarked to him, "We are attending the Queen's 3rd funeral." Not a word was said as we passed slowly round the ambulatory in the darkness. Her remains inside of a thick English oak coffin were marked by an inscription showing the bizarre journey her remains had been on. They built a new tomb near to the altar, and in Henry V's chapel her remains were laid to rest 400 years finally after the death of Catherine of Valois. The inscription marked, "It is the latest royal tomb in the abbey, and though long delayed, it has been thought that the singular and romantic history of a French princess and an English queen should at length be brought to an honourable end. Requiescate in pace." Catherine of Valois' body and remains were subjected to a horrific treatment in the years after her death, and people even kissed her decaying remains hundreds of years after she succumbed to death. It was a horrific thing, and people inside of Westminster Abbey even tried to make money from the unburied Queen. Yet she never deserved this, and she was a queen who was not given any respect following her death. One of the most captivating women of the 16th century was Mary, Queen of Scots. She had a very tumultuous love life, and she was married to the King of France that died young, and she also married a man who was blown up. Her 3rd husband was the man suspected of killing her 2nd, but inside the walls of a modest castle in England, Mary, Queen of Scots would be executed in brutal fashion. A headsman took her head off in a number of swings of his axe, following her death sentence for treason. Mary had been involved in a number of plots against the life of Queen Elizabeth I, and following the Babington plot, the Queen of England had had enough and finally signed her death warrant. But following her execution, Mary's body was not treated well and was originally buried nearby at Peterborough Cathedral. However, this was then dug up and moved to Westminster Abbey. But on a number of occasions, Mary's executed resting body was disinterred and was even broken into when it was placed in its final resting place. Mary, Queen of Scots, was not executed in one single strike of the axe. The first blow missed her neck and struck the back of her head, and the second blow severed the neck except a small bit of sinew, which was then cut through using the executioner's axe. Her head was held aloft inside the great hall of Fotheringhay Castle, and the executioner declared, "God save the Queen." Following this, her wig came loose, and her head then fell onto the floor. But after her execution, everything which was touched by her blood, including her clothing and even the executioner's block, was thrown into the fireplace of the great hall, to stop relic hunters obtaining relics from the dead Queen of Scotland. Mary's execution greatly distressed Queen Elizabeth I, and she even had one of her counsellors thrown inside the Tower of London. But Mary, Queen of Scots, before her death, had given strict instruction that after her death she wanted to be buried in France alongside her 1st husband. This was refused by Elizabeth I, and her body was then embalmed and was left inside a secure lead coffin inside the walls of Fotheringhay Castle. Mary's body was left unburied and in a coffin which was sealed for a number of months, as a suitable location to bury her was not found. Eventually the authorities settled on Peterborough Cathedral, which was the closest cathedral to the execution site. Her entrails and heart were buried within Fotheringhay Castle's grounds, and then after 6 months Elizabeth I ordered her burial. Mary's request was denied, and the brutal register for Peterborough Cathedral for 1587 said, "The Queen of Scots was most sumptuously buried in ye Cathedral Church of Peterborough, the 1st day of August 1587, who was beheaded at Fotheringhay Castle, the 8th of February before. Queen Elizabeth's household officers and heralds arrived in Peterborough in later July to choose the burial place, and they selected a site directly opposite Catherine of Aragon, the first wife of Henry VIII. A rich hearse was erected near the first steps of the choir, and the whole of the cathedral was decorated with black hangings. On the 30th of July, between 1 a.m. and 2 a.m, the body was brought from Fotheringhay by torchlight in a chariot hung with black velvet, adorned with Mary Queen of Scots symbols. It was attended on by the Bishop and Dean of Peterborough, and many other officials, along with members of Mary's household. The body was taken into the cathedral, and then it was laid into the vault. On the Monday afternoon, a group of lords and ladies arrived at the bishop's palace, which was hung in black, and then the following morning, members of the clergy and lords and ladies gathered in the cathedral for a sermon by the Bishop of Lincoln, who said that he hoped Mary was saved, despite having died a Catholic. Her officials and servants then broke their staves of office and placed them in Mary's grave, and then mourners had another huge feast, and everyone went home. A helmet, sword, and shield were then installed to hang above the tomb, but this was not what Mary wanted. But her tomb and grave would then be broken into. In 1603, following the death of Elizabeth I, Mary's son James succeeded onto the throne, and became known as King James I. He was already the Scottish king, and he unionised the crowns, but 3 years after coming onto the throne, he began to plan for the reburial of his mother inside of Westminster Abbey. Plans took years to be drawn up, and Mary Queen of Scots would be reburied in 1612, with an extravagant tomb taking 6 years to complete. Her remains were then dug up from Peterborough Cathedral, and they were taken on the journey to Westminster Abbey in London. A royal warrant granted the burial, and this took place on the 11th of October. The King James I had erected a magnificent marble tomb for her on the south aisle of the Lady Chapel, under a fine white marble effigy, under a canopy. Her effigy showed her wearing a close-fitting coif, a laced ruff and long mantle. A crowned Scottish lion stands by her feet. She was buried in a chapel opposite Elizabeth I, but her tomb was slightly grander than Elizabeth's, a small dig that James I had against the Queen who ordered his mother's execution. But Mary Queen of Scots' remains would be broken into yet again, and in 1867 Arthur P. Stanley, the Dean of Westminster, would oversee and order a search of her vault. The Dean of Westminster at the time was searching for the lost tomb of King James I, which was later found in the vault of Henry VII and Elizabeth of York, but at the time they believed that the remains could have been found within the same vault of his mother, Mary Queen of Scots. After the exhumation and lifting of the tomb, Stanley found that Mary's lead coffin was along the north wall of the vault, but she was not alone. Shockingly, the vault contained a number of other burials too, meaning that over the years, Mary Queen of Scots' vault had been opened a number of times, with other members of the royal family being interred near to her. Mary was found beneath that of Lady Arabella, Stuart's coffin, and inside the vault was also Henry, the Prince of Wales, Anne Hyde, the Duchess of York, and the mother of 2 Stuart queens, Mary II and Anne, Elizabeth, the Winter Queen of Bohemia, Prince Rupert of the Rhine, and also many children of James II were also held here. Interestingly, many of those inside this vault were descendants of the Stuarts, the very dynasty that Mary was the head of. Queen Anne and her surviving child, the Duke of Gloucester, were also found there. But throughout the centuries, Mary Queen of Scots, following her death, was disturbed a number of times. Following her brutal execution, she was disemboweled, and her remains were then buried inside the grounds of Fotheringhay Castle. Then her body was taken to the nearby Cathedral of Peterborough, before it was buried in a huge ceremony there, with a lot of respect. But around 25 years later,
She was disinterred and dug up again at the request of her son, the then King of England and Scotland. She was then taken to Westminster Abbey, and the heart of religion in England, and was buried in a huge and ornate tomb befitting her status. Then, 200 years after this, her vault was disturbed as the officials inside of Westminster Abbey were searching for the remains of her son. Despite living a very captivating life, her final moments were chaotic, botched, and still today she is laid to rest in a place nowhere near where she wanted to be.
The most notorious King of England was Henry VIII, and he is best remembered for his brutal side, but also the fact he was married 6 times and had 6 different wives. The wives of Henry VIII had very different fates, but possibly the most tragic of them all was Catherine Howard, the 5th wife of the Tudor king. It's believed that when Henry VIII married Catherine, he was 49 years old, but Catherine was between just 15 to 21 years of age, and the huge age gap would signal the doomed short-lived marriage which led to the execution of Henry's wife. On the 13th of February 1542, Catherine Howard made her way to the executioner's scaffold inside of the walls of the Tower of London. It took the executioner 1 strike of the axe to take Catherine's head clean off. However, what happened after this was her burial was shocking and barbaric, and was not fit for a woman who was married to the king. But what is the story of opening the coffin of Henry VIII's 5th wife? Catherine Howard and King Henry VIII married on the 28th of July 1540, and she was a carefree young woman who probably did not realise what she was getting herself into. Her early life had been considered to have been marked with rumours of scandal. However, during the marriage to the king, Catherine grew closer to the king's favourite courtier, Thomas Culpeper, and it was said that Culpeper had succeeded in the affections of the queen at the expense of the king. Some historians have considered that Culpeper may have wanted to marry Catherine Howard before Henry got involved, but the pair, by the spring of 1541, were now meeting in secret, and during these meetings it's believed that things were physical between the two. These meetings were overseen by Jane Boleyn, one of the ladies-in-waiting for Catherine, and rumours emerged at court about this, and things were not kept a secret. The questions about Catherine's earlier behaviour with men also continued with regards to what happened while she was in the care of Agnes Tilney, the Duchess of Norfolk. It's believed she had intimate relations with others before she became the king's wife, and this would have therefore invalidated their marriage. Thomas Cranmer, the Archbishop of Canterbury, was dispatched to investigate, and he then brought the allegations to the mind of the king, and the evidence against Catherine was compelling. A love letter was even produced which had been written by her to Culpeper. On the 23rd of November 1531, Catherine Howard was stripped of the title of Queen, and she was then imprisoned before being condemned to death. Thomas Culpeper was executed by beheading alongside another man, Francis Derham, who it was believed had a pre-contract of marriage with Catherine Howard, and he was hanged, drawn and quartered. Both of these had their heads taken off, and they were placed high on spikes above London Bridge before Catherine was then taken to the Tower of London for her final days, and Catherine screamed as she passed by the heads of her former lovers. On the evening of the 12th of February 1542, whilst she was housed inside of the Tower of London, Catherine was told she would be executed the next morning, and she was told to prepare for her execution. The next morning she was to be executed by axe, and by the commoner's axe, but she was allowed a private execution befitting her status as the king's wife. She was said to have had the block brought to her chambers so she could practice late into the night as how to lay her head upon it, so the executioner could perform her death quickly and swiftly without any need for more than one swing. On the morning of the 13th of February 1542, Catherine emerged from her chambers in front of a number of councillors, ambassadors and lords who had been gathered to witness the proceedings, and it was said that she was helped to the scaffold as she was so weak, an eyewitness claimed. The Queen was so weak that she could hardly speak, but confessed in few words that she had merited 100 deaths for so offending the King, who had so graciously treated her. Another witness said how the Queen had made the most godly and Christian end, and asked all Christian people to take regard under her worthy and just punishment with death, for her offences against God, and heinously from her youth upward in breaking all of his commandments, and also against the King's royal majesty very dangerously. While she was on the scaffold, she apologised for her crimes and then knelt down at the executioner's block in the manner that she had practised in the night. The executioner then stood with his axe, and he swung the weapon down quickly, and in one swift strike Catherine's head was taken clean off. She was not given a swordsman for the job, and she died by the commoner's axe in the way someone could be if they were spared hanging, drawing and quartering for treason. After her death, a number of women, and it's believed ladies-in-waiting to Catherine Howard, or those who had come to care for her on the scaffold, they collected her body and her head and wrapped them in a black cloth. It's possible that they collected these inside of a wooden box, or that they may have just simply wrapped her remains in the cloth to be taken into the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula, the Tower's chapel next to the scaffold. It was here where Anne Boleyn, Henry VIII's second wife, and many other high-ranking Tudor officials were buried, and those also lost their heads on Tower Hill were brought into the Tower's walls to be interred inside of this chapel. But the burial of Catherine Howard was horrific. She was buried by her ladies, but it could have been John Gage, the Constable of the Tower of London, who was in charge of the execution and subsequent burial of the prisoner in the Tower's chapel. Anne Boleyn, during her burial, was placed in an oak chest, but this is not known for Catherine Howard, and she may have just been dumped into a shallow grave, with little or no coffin. There were then claims made that those who were overseeing the burial then poured a large amount of quicklime onto the body of Catherine Howard in her grave, and the effects of this was to make her remains decay a lot quicker, so that Catherine Howard would literally be wiped off the face of the earth. Her remains would have dissolved quickly, and it was a sign of Henry VIII ridding himself of the disastrous fifth wife he had in the form of Catherine Howard. He was disregarding her, almost like trash. However, the women who attended on her would not have been the ones who did this, and they did not have quicklime on them, so this would have been organised by the Constable of the Tower of London, and it's considered that Henry VIII ordered this request himself to make it seem like Catherine had never once set foot upon the earth. Quicklime as a substance was used for centuries with burials, and was even placed in plague pits centuries before to quicken decay and to try and kill deadly diseases. But it led to Catherine Howard's remains being treated awfully, but this would not be the end of the story. 300 years later, during the reign of Queen Victoria, visitors to the Tower of London's chapel had remarked how it was not a place fit for the burial of queens and royals, as it had fallen into a state of disrepair. One visitor stated, "I cannot refrain from expressing my disgust at the barbarous stupidity which has transformed this interesting little church into the likeness of a meeting house in a manufacturing town. In truth, there is no sadder spot on earth than this little cemetery." But in 1875, a proposal was submitted to restore the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula and to make it a place fit for a royal burial. However, during the works, the chapel's floor was removed, and the remains of high-ranking Tudor figures, including Anne Boleyn and others who were executed, were discovered. Queen Victoria then sanctioned the removal of the victims of the Tower of London and also Tower Hill, and she said that the greatest care and reverence should be exercised in this removal, and that a careful record should be kept of every sign of possible identification which might come to light. The workers found Anne Boleyn's remains, and the Queen's doctor came in to look at her remains, and he stated of them that at this depth the bones of a female were found, not lying in the original order, but which had evidently, for some reason or other, been heaped together into a smaller space. All these bones were examined by Dr. Mowat, who had once pronounced those to be of a female between 25 and 30 years of age, of a delicate frame of body, and who had been of slender and perfect proportions. The forehead and lower jaw were small, and especially well formed. However, the search was on to find the remains of Catherine Howard, Henry's fifth wife. It was known for certain that Catherine was buried inside of the chapel, and there were even some questions raised that the body of Anne Boleyn may have even been Catherine. But despite searching as hard as they could, no remains were found that could be tracked back to Catherine Howard. There were many questions as to what had happened to her body and remains, and some theories offer explanation. The first is that the quicklime over the centuries did its job quicker than it was believed, as Henry VIII intended, and Catherine Howard was literally wiped off the earth, with her body being dissolved in the substance. Another belief is that Catherine was so young at the time of her execution that her bones had not yet consolidated and gone hard, and that they decayed quicker than they would have done if she was older. There were 2 skeletons found in a south-east direction near to the wall of the chapel, and the investigators hoped that one of these may be Catherine. One of these was much smaller than the other. However, after analysing the bones, it was discovered that these remains belonged to Jane Boleyn, Lady Rochford, who was executed after Catherine on the same scaffold, and was forced to kneel in her blood, and the other skeleton belonged to Margaret Pole, the Countess of Salisbury. These 2 women were both victims of the Tower of London and King Henry VIII. It would have made sense for Catherine Howard to be buried close to Jane Boleyn, as one pit could have been dug for them both, but the remains found were not Catherine's. The only possible remains that could have belonged to the 5th wife of Henry VIII were found close to Margaret Pole, and these were a collection of bones that had been heavily eroded and decayed using lime, which does fit the story. But the story of Henry VIII's 5th wife is a horrific one, and she may have just been a teenager when she lost her head inside the Tower of London at the hands of an axeman. But today her bones and remains may still lie under the chapel's floor undiscovered. One of the most shocking executions of the Tudor period was when a young teenage girl during the reign of Queen Mary I was executed inside of the Tower of London. This young girl is often regarded as a queen and is remembered in history as the 9-day queen. Lady Jane Grey's demise inside the Tower of London is shocking, and she lost her head at the sharp end of the axe. She was allowed a private execution within the walls of the fortress, unlike her husband, who was dragged out onto Tower Hill, where his head was hacked from his shoulders. But after Jane's execution, she was then taken into the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula, the Tower's chapel, and she was then buried inside of the same place where 2 of Henry VIII's wives and other countless important Tudor people were interred following their executions. But during the reign of Queen Victoria, efforts were made to exhume her, and there was a search for her. Lady Jane Grey became the Queen of England following the death of her cousin, Edward VI. The former Tudor king and son of Henry VIII had named Jane his successor to keep his half-sisters Mary and Elizabeth off the throne. But Jane was taken to the Tower of London in the July of 1553 following her proclamation of queen to await her coronation. But it was the eldest daughter of Henry VIII, Mary, who would depose Jane, and she rose up inside of her nation, and she caused a significant rebellion to the point where the Privy Council switched their support to Mary. The effect of this was that Lady Jane Grey, the young teenage Protestant 9-day queen, was deposed, and the place where she was to await her coronation then became her prison. Her husband was also imprisoned, Guildford Dudley, and he was a man who dreamed of being made king by his wife. But Jane continued to refuse this during her short time on the throne. Jane was charged with high treason, and her trial took place at the Guildhall on the 13th of November 1553, and a special commission was to deal with her charges on behalf of Queen Mary I, who is of course also known as Bloody Mary. She was found guilty, and Jane's guilt was established as she assumed the title and the power of a monarch, and she signed some documents as Jane the Queen. But she was then sentenced to be burnt alive on Tower Hill or beheaded as the Queen pleases. But there was a belief after this that her life was to be spared by the new Queen Mary, and this was the perception that emerged after. But the major problem with Jane's fate was that she remained a threat to the Catholic Queen Mary's crown, and when a pro-Protestant rebellion emerged across England, it was clear that Mary would deal with her teenage cousin once and for all. She decided to sign the death warrant, and her execution was scheduled to go ahead on the 9th of February 1554, but it was postponed for 3 days, as Jane was given a chance to save her life if she converted to Catholicism. But Jane did not do this, and because of this she would be executed 3 days later. On the morning of her execution, she witnessed her husband Guildford leave the Tower for his execution, and she then also witnessed her husband's headless corpse returning back inside of the Tower for burial. And she screamed out when she saw this. It was shortly after this that Lady Jane Grey was summoned from her chambers for her execution. There was a scaffold inside of the Tower where she was led towards, and when she reached the scaffold she claimed, "Good people, I am come hither to die, and by the law I am condemned to the same. The fact indeed against the Queen's Highness was unlawful, and the consenting thereunto by me. But touching the procurement and desire thereof by me or on my behalf, I do wash my hands thereof in innocency, before God and the face of you, good Christian people, this day." This speech was remarkable, and it's considered that she was either 16 or just 17 when she was executed by an axeman who stood armed with his weapon of death. She admitted to her crimes, and she asked the executioner to dispatch her quickly, and she prepared herself. A blindfold was placed over her eyes, and then when she went to reach out for the block, she panicked, and a witness then helped her find her way to the block. And in one savage and quick strike from the axe, Lady Jane Grey was executed. Following this, her remains and head were then buried inside of the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula. This was close to the scaffold, and she was buried in a quick and hastily dug grave near to the altar. But let's remember that Jane was a Queen of England, and she did possess royal blood, meaning that it's most likely that she was buried close to the altar, which was said to have been reserved for prominent people. No memorial stone was placed on her grave, but during the Victorian time, work occurred inside of the chapel. There were renovations made because it was deemed that the chapel was not fit enough of a place for the burial of queens, and Jane was buried alongside Anne Boleyn and Catherine Howard, as well as others such as Margaret Pole, who possessed royal blood. But the work which was carried out included the floor of the chapel being lifted, as it was said to have been uneven, and because of this there was a significant amount of exhumation ordered of the burials near to the altar. The coffins of these people had decayed, and a huge number of burials were found inside of the chapel. But a remarkable number of burials were found. One of the most significant was the burial of Anne Boleyn, and Queen Victoria's physician was brought in to identify the remains of her, and he confirmed that this was Henry VIII's executed second wife, and she had lost her head in a dramatic fashion, and the remains of Anne were found just 2 feet down. The bones had piled in one spot, and the amount of investigation into Anne's remains was remarkable. However, there was more work to do inside of the chapel. It had been recorded that Lady Jane Grey and also Catherine Howard had been buried inside of the chapel nearby too. The search was on for Lady Jane's remains and body, however,
It's claimed that a number of prominent Tudors were buried on the west side of the chancel, inside of the chapel. Work was not specifically being carried out here, and it was here where the remains of Lady Jane Grey were found. What is surprising is that her remains were discovered as she was just a young girl, and one thing to consider is the age of her when she was executed, as her bones may have not fully hardened as she was a teenager. It's expected that her bones may not have stood the test of centuries, leading to the possibility that she was buried rather decently inside of a coffin. What is also interesting is that Jane was buried close to her husband, or next to him, and that Queen Mary I did bury her with significant dignity, allowing Jane to be buried next to Guildford, and also near to her father-in-law. This was something Henry VIII, Mary's father, would not have permitted. For example, his fifth wife, Catherine Howard, had her remains covered in quicklime to literally wipe her off the face of England. It is believed that Jane's body may have been placed inside of a new lead casket, and that this was then held inside of the Queen's house for some time inside the Tower, whilst works were being carried out. Her body, if this was the case, would have been held in the same rooms as Anne Boleyn and other executed figures, before it was then reburied close to the high altar, with the lead casket having a plaque on that carried the name of Jane. There have been a consideration that the bones of Anne Boleyn could have actually been Jane, but this is debated also. Still, today Lady Jane Grey is buried inside of the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula, and she was laid to rest a short distance away from where she lost her head. She was around 16 years old when she was brutally executed at the hands of Queen Mary I, or Bloody Mary, but it looked like she would be spared during her life, and it looked as if she would have escaped with mere imprisonment. Jane was someone who did not want to be queen, neither did she ask for it. The crown was thrust upon her in a religious solidification of the English Protestant Reformation, but her fate was horrific.
One of the greatest queens to ever reign over England was Elizabeth I, the final Tudor monarch. It was during her decades on the throne that she saw the Elizabethan period, a time of great change where writers such as Shakespeare were thriving, and she managed to also see off some great threats to her throne. Elizabeth I ended the life of one of her greatest opponents, Mary Queen of Scots, by having her executed inside the walls of Fotheringhay Castle. But Elizabeth I also managed to defeat the Spanish Armada, the greatest enemy and army of the time across Europe, but Elizabeth was a queen who was loved by her followers and population, and she was very popular. Following her death in 1603, there was a huge outpouring of grief across England and the nation, and many people could not see what the nation would be like without her reigning over them. However, following her death, she was interred in a burial vault with her grandfather, Henry VII, before she was then dug up and moved to her final resting place. But what is this burial vault like, and why was it broken into? It was in the morning of the 24th of March 1603 that Elizabeth I died. She had suffered in the final months of her life with depression, and she had ruled for a very long time. But she was an elderly woman by the standards of the early 17th century, and she had lived for some time. She had defied many bouts of illness throughout her life, and she had beaten smallpox, a deadly disease that struck many people across England every year. But one issue that Elizabeth's court had with regards to her death was what to do with the throne following her death. She did not have any children. Because of this, the Scottish King James was invited to reign over England and Scotland, and he was the son of Mary Queen of Scots, the very woman that Elizabeth had executed. Elizabeth I in her final days was very depressed, and she often was very vacant and seemed deep in thought. She was contemplating the executions that she had ordered, and this included the execution of Mary, and she believed that this would stop her getting into heaven because she had sanctioned the execution of another anointed queen, who many believed had been sent by God to rule the Scots. But Elizabeth I was almost 70 when she went onto her deathbed, and she was accompanied by her closest friends and servants, and she was then attended on by the Archbishop of Canterbury. He offered the Queen spiritual guidance, and he told her that she would rule again in heaven as a queen. But her close friends who had died in the months before were in her thoughts, and Elizabeth believed she would one day see them again in the afterlife. And she was told to hold God in her thoughts who would guide her through. However, the Queen's throat swelled and she struggled to speak, and because of this, many knew that death was coming. Inside of her private bedroom in Richmond Palace, Elizabeth I died, and she had left instructions as what should happen to her remains following her death. She specifically did not want to be disemboweled during the embalming process, but this was not listened to. During this process, the royal doctors and physicians cut open the Queen's body, and they removed her heart and also her other organs, and then her chest was stuffed with spices to keep away decay in an effort to preserve her before her funeral. But this proved to be the correct decision, as during the procession to her burial site of Westminster Abbey, it's believed that her body exploded due to the release of a number of gases, and that the explosion then even splintered the coffin and caused damage to it. However, Elizabeth, after her death, was then placed inside of a lead-lined coffin which had been decorated with Tudor imagery, and she was left inside of Richmond Palace before it was then time for the funeral procession. The journey was rather long, and it gave the public a chance to see their queen and to pay their respects to her. Elizabeth's coffin was placed on the royal barge and was then transported down the River Thames and then travelled towards the Palace of Whitehall. The coffin was covered in black velvet and her ladies kept watch on it. However, it was claimed that during the procession on the Thames that the oars at every stroke did tears let fall, and it was a very sorry sight. One onlooker wrote of the funeral procession that begun on the 28th of April 1603 that the city of Westminster was subcharged with a multitude of all sorts of people in the streets, houses, leads and gutters that came to see the obsequies. There was such a general sighing, groaning and weeping as the like has not been seen or known in the memory of man. On top of Elizabeth I's coffin was also her funeral effigy, which was dressed in her Parliament robes, and on the head of the effigy was the crown of the Queen. In her hands were the sceptres of power, and this was significant, as this was a first time for most that they had seen an image of their Queen. When the coffin arrived at Westminster Abbey, it was carried into the church by the yeomen of the guard, and the funeral of the Queen was conducted by Dean Andrews of Westminster, and following this her coffin was taken to the Lady Chapel ready for burial. To begin with, the burial vault was actually the same as Henry VII and Elizabeth of York's, and she was buried under the tomb of her grandparents, which was said to have been an honour, and at the heart of the Lady Chapel. But then following this, her body would be moved later on. James I, the Queen's successor, was determined to win over his new population, and one way in which he did this was to honour Elizabeth, as she was so popular. He ordered a large tomb to be built for her, but he also ordered that Elizabeth should be exhumed and then moved to a different vault, the vault being her half-sister's, Mary I's, resting place, and it was then said that Elizabeth's coffin should be placed directly on top of Mary's to express her dominance over her half-sister in her reign. This tomb for Elizabeth is huge and is still there today, and she was buried in a room opposite her rival, Mary, Queen of Scots. It was said that 46 shillings and 4 pence was paid for the removal of Elizabeth's body, and then for the reburial in the new vault. However, in 1880, a book was published by the Dean of Westminster, Arthur Stanley, and in this he documents his exploration into the different vaults and burial sites of Westminster Abbey. He had been given special permission to look inside the royal vaults, and he wanted to locate the coffin of King James I. And he did find this in the burial vault of Henry VII and Elizabeth of York. So James had moved Elizabeth I out of this vault so that he could then be buried inside of it. But Arthur Stanley then explored some other rooms from the royal vault, and he came across an aisle underground at the east end of the tomb of Elizabeth I. and he found a small opening in the wall where he then crept through and entered the burial vault of Elizabeth I and Mary I. There were no other coffins, but Elizabeth I's remains had been laid to rest for 2 centuries. He wrote about what he saw and said, "The excavations, however, had almost laid bare the wall immediately at the eastern end of the monument of Elizabeth, and through a small aperture a view was obtained into a low, narrow vault immediately beneath her tomb. It was instantly evident that it enclosed 2 coffins, and 2 only, and it could not be doubted that these contained Elizabeth and her sister Mary, the upper one larger, and more distinctly shaped in the form of the body, like that of Mary Queen of Scots, rested on the other. There was no disorder or decay, except that the centering wood had fallen over the head of Elizabeth's coffin, and that the wood case had crumbled away at the sides and had drawn away part vault of the decaying lid. No coffin plate could be discovered, but fortunately the dim light fell on a fragment of the lid slightly carved. This led to a further search, and the original inscription was discovered. There was the Tudor badge, a full double rose, deeply but simply incised in outline on the middle of the cover. On each side the august initials E.R. and below the memorable date 1603. The coffin lid had been further decorated with narrow moulded panelling. The coffin case was of inch elm, but the ornamental lid containing the inscription and panelling was of fine oak, half an inch thick, laid on the inch elm cover. The whole was covered in red silk velvet, of which much remained attached to the wood, and it had covered not only the sides and ends, but also the ornamented oak cover, as though the bare wood had not been thought rich enough without the velvet. The sight of this secluded and narrow tomb, thus compressing in the closest grasp the 2 Tudor sisters, partners of the same throne and grave, sleeping in the hope of resurrection. The solemn majesty of the great queen thus reposing, as can hardly be doubted by her own desire, on her sister's coffin, was the more impressive form the contrast of its quiet calm with the confused and multitudinous decay of the Stuart vault, and of the fullness of its tragic interest with the vacancy of the deserted spaces which had been inherited too, explored in the other part of the chapel. The vault was then immediately closed. Not since Arthur Stanley ventured into the burial vault of Elizabeth I has anyone, it's believed, ever been in and documented what they saw. It's considered a sacred space, and the final Tudor monarch is laid to rest in a better manner than others inside of Westminster Abbey had been.
On the 16th of October 1793, in Paris, the Queen of France, Marie Antoinette, made her slow way to the executioner's scaffold. She was a woman who was hated across her nation, and her husband had lost his head in the months before, and there were many people questioning what to do with the Queen. Marie was a symbol of ridicule and animosity, as she would live a very lavish life whilst the people of her nation were starving and suffering, and Marie did not seem to care one bit. She was accused of a number of serious charges, including treason, and this led to her execution. However, following the guillotine blade falling upon her neck, Marie was hastily buried in a grave in a nearby cemetery, but she would then be exhumed and her coffin was opened. What was found by those who discovered the Queen's remains was shocking. Marie Antoinette was tried by a revolutionary tribunal on the 14th of October 1793, and this was a shocking thing, as the Queen of France was being accused of so many serious charges that she could have died. Many of the people in the kingdom believed that she was actually condemned to death when she was brought to her trial, and her lawyers did not have time to gather a decent defence for her. But she was, as mentioned, accused of the most shocking charges, including incest and depletion of the national treasury and sending money to Austria and her homeland, as she was an Austrian princess. She was also said to have been guilty of plotting massacres, and on the 16th of October, 2 days later, she was found guilty of 3 main charges: conspiracy against the security of the state, high treason, and running down the national treasury and the finances of France. Her lawyers never thought that she would be sentenced to death, and they thought she would be sent into exile and banished from ever returning to France. But she was sentenced to death, and was condemned, which shocked many. She was then sent to her prison to prepare for her execution, and she did not have a long time to wait. Marie was forced to change into a plain white dress by her guards, and she got dressed in front of their leering eyes, and then her hair was roughly cut short to prevent it snagging in the blade of the guillotine and stopping the execution device making a clean and clear cut on her neck. But she was then led out of her prison cell to an open cart, and she had her arms tied behind her back, and the guards even attached a lead on her like a dog. This cart then slowly processed through Paris and to the Place de la Révolution, which would become her execution site. The people of Paris shouted and jeered at her, and even threw things. The once lavish Queen of France was being taken on the parade of the dead, and it took an hour for the cart to get to the guillotine intended for her. On the final journey, Marie was calm, and she sat with her priest next to her, and she was in a strange mental state, and it's believed she may have just wanted her horrific ordeal and her terrible few years to be over. The former Queen of France arrived at the execution scaffold and the guillotine at 12:15 p.m, and she then climbed down from the cart and was guided up the stairs to the scaffold. She even accidentally stood on the foot of the executioner, and this prompted her final words, which were, "Pardon me, sir, I did not do it on purpose." The executioner then placed her on the wooden board, which was then slid under the guillotine blade. Final checks were made, and the executioner then released the blade, and in one swift cut, Marie Antoinette's head was taken clean off. It was then picked up by the executioner, who showed it to the crowd, and one painting even shows how it may have been paraded by the executioner on a pike. But her remains were quickly collected, including her head, and these were taken to the Madeleine Cemetery, a short distance away. She was to be buried in an unmarked grave with no pomp and ceremony. But at some point, Marie Antoinette's head was moulded by Madame Tussaud. However, Marie Antoinette's head and body were buried inside of the Madeleine Cemetery for a number of decades, and they were left undisturbed. But people did know where the remains were buried, and some even toured the cemetery to pay their respects. But in 1814, King Louis XVIII ordered an investigation into the possibility of digging up Marie Antoinette and her husband, Louis XVI's body, and remains so they could be given a proper and decent burial. It was hoped that the pair would be buried inside of the royal mausoleum. Louis XVI's body was found on the 18th of January 1815, and Marie's body was also found very easily. What the grave diggers discovered was quite remarkable. A layer of quicklime had been poured onto the coffin of Marie, and it had preserved her remains as it solidified. They found her remains were wearing the stockings that she was given in prison, and these were recorded in accounts at the time as Marie wearing them on the way to her execution. These stockings confirmed that this was Marie's coffin, and many then prayed at her gravesite. There was also confirmation that the Queen had lost her head, as the body clearly showed that she had been decapitated by a sharp instrument that performed a clean cut. Also parts of her hair were found on her head, and then the remains of Marie were placed inside a new coffin and a chest. Anything else found in the coffin was also collected, and then preparations were made to inter her in a proper burial site befitting her status. The decision was that she and her husband would be buried inside of the Basilica of St. Denis, and it was said of the ceremony and the reburial of the Queen that a detachment of artillery joined the procession at the barrier St. Denis and followed it, firing minute guns. A regiment of the King's chasseurs lined the road from Paris to St. Denis. The drums and musical instruments were covered with black serge, and the arms and colours of the troops were ornamented with crape. A deep and solemn silence prevailed among the multitudes who thronged the streets and roads by which the procession passed. Upon reaching the church of St. Denis, the bodies were taken from the cart by the guards de la Marche and carried into the church, where they were received by the clergy and presented by the Bishop of Carsacone to the Bishop of Arles. They were then placed upon a lofty tomb of slate in the midst of the choir. Monsieur, after retiring for a few minutes, entered the church and was followed by the Duke of Angoulême, the Duke of Berry, the Duke of Orleans, and the Prince de Conde, who occupied the stalls on the right nearest the altar. The Duchess of Orleans, the Duchess of Bourbon, and Mademoiselle of Orleans entered the opposite stalls. Next to the prince sat the Duke of Dalmatia, the Duke of Reggio, Count Bartholomew, and Emmeline, whom the king had appointed to support the plough when the coffins were carried to the vault. The other stalls were occupied by deputations from the Court of Cassation, the Court of Accompts, the councils of the University, and the Cour Royale, the municipality, the Tribunal de Première Instance. The choir was filled by the great officers of the king's household, the officers of the prince's household, his majesty's ministers, the high personages appointed to form part of the procession, the marshals and peers of France, the deputies of the departments, the grand crosses of the order of the Major General and staff of the National Guards, the governor of the 1st Military Division and his staff, and a great number of generals and other military officers. The governess of the royal children, the ladies-in-waiting upon her late Majesty, and the ladies-in-waiting upon the Duchess of Angoulême sat upon benches near the coffins. 400 young ladies of the Maison Royale de la Saint-Denis were seated in front of the altar. When all these attendants had taken their places, the service commenced. The princes and princesses, followed by the Grand Master and Master of the Ceremonies, and their assistants, approached the altar to present their offerings, after which a funeral oration was delivered by the Bishop of Troyes. The absolution having been pronounced, the bodies were lowered into the royal vault, and into which Monsieur and the 2 princes, his sons, descended and prostrated themselves upon the coffins of their royal relatives. Salutes of artillery were fired at the moment when the procession set out from Paris, during the service at St. Denis, and when the bodies were lowered into the vault. To perpetuate the memory of those august victims, the king has ordained that solemn funeral services shall be performed annually in all the churches of the kingdom on the 21st of January for the repose of the souls of Louis XVI, and on the 16th of October for that of his royal consort, and that on those days the court shall wear mourning, and the public offices, courts of justice, exchange, and theatres be closed. When the gravediggers discovered the remains of Marie Antoinette, they were amazed, and to many, following this brief restoration of the monarchy, she was a martyr and a victim of the French Revolution. Still today, her remains are buried inside of the royal mausoleum, and she is considered a very controversial lady in history. But the discovery of her coffin and the subsequent opening of this was a monumentous moment in European history. Queen Victoria, the iconic ruler of the UK and Britain, died inside of her bedchambers. Her bedroom, despite being small, was filled with mourning members of her family, many who were weeping heavily, and there were many people inside of this room who would one day play a role in the outbreak of the First World War. But Victoria's family believed that she would never die, and they thought she would live forever, and they did not take her final illness well. Victoria herself was a woman who had a deep affinity with death and had remained in mourning for her husband, Prince Albert, for decades, following his early and shocking death. But the British public also had not known anything different, as Victoria had ruled for almost 64 years, and at the time this was longer than any other monarch in British and English history. But secretly, as the doctor made preparations for her body after her death, and they prepared to place us in the coffin, he and one of the Queen's dressers would sneakily carry out the final wishes of Victoria, and they had a number of items placed inside of her coffin. Many of these would have caused great offence inside the royal family, but this was Victoria's final wish. But what was inside the coffin of Queen Victoria? And these items are still there today, alongside the remains of the Queen in the Royal Mausoleum in Frogmore. Queen Victoria's death took many people by surprise, but it was clear to the royal doctors that the Queen in the year 1900 was rather ill and that she was actually suffering. She had a number of rough months following a number of close deaths, and she went to Osborne House on the Isle of Wight, and whilst here she was pushed around in a wheelchair and struggled to see as well. She passed away at 6:30 in the evening on the 22nd of January 1901 at the age of 81. With her were many members of her family, including her children and successor, Edward VII, along with the Kaiser Wilhelm II of Germany. After she passed, her favourite pet, her dog, was placed upon her deathbed, and then instructions for her funeral were dug out and the mourning period began. But there was a lot of chaos, as no one had any experience in planning a royal funeral, and with this there was a lot of arguing between the Lord Chamberlain and other members of the family. Victoria had stated that for her funeral she wanted a military ceremony befitting the daughter of a soldier, and as she was the head of the armed forces, she wanted a huge military presence. She also indicated that she wanted people to wear white instead of black, but a number of calamitous problems then arose. The first of which is the most laughable, was that when the royal undertakers were summoned from London to the Isle of Wight to prepare her body, and then to collect it and bring it back to the English mainland. But they actually forgot the very coffin that Victoria had made years or decades before, and a local craftsman was then ordered to create the coffin that the Queen would be buried in. Queen Victoria had, though, made a number of secret requests to her doctor and close friend Dr. Reed, who she knew would be the one who prepared her body inside of the coffin, and she also informed one of her dressers to help in this. The pair had been given a number of specific instructions as to items that needed to be placed inside of her coffin, and some of these items would have caused a significant degree of offence to the royal family. The first request was made by Victoria that she wanted a plaster mould and cast of her late husband, Prince Albert's hands, to be put inside of the coffin. Albert died in 1861 when he was 42 years old, and the Queen never recovered from his loss. But she wanted his hands to be with her inside of the coffin until the end of time. Dr. Reed also placed one of Albert's dressing gowns inside of the coffin, and this was a garment that her husband wore to bed often, and these were insisted upon by Victoria, and they were a romantic gesture linking the Queen to her deceased love. These were both rather normal items for a woman to be buried with, and she also asked for her wedding ring to be placed inside of the coffin, and this was then placed on her ring finger. But also, Victoria was dressed with her lace wedding veil over her face, and she wanted this as she had kept this from her wedding day, and she wanted her white veil to symbolise that she was reunited with the love of her life, and this was seen as a release from the mourning and grief that she had been plunged into for decades. The veil was said to have been the end of her sadness, but many other pieces of jewellery and jewels were placed on her body, and she wanted as much jewellery on her body as possible. A ring was placed on every one of her fingers, her neck was covered in necklaces, and she had a lot of bracelets on her wrists. Victoria also stated she wanted a cape that her dead daughter Alice had made for her husband when she was young, and Victoria was very close to Alice, who had died in 1878. She was the first of Victoria's children to die, and this broke Victoria's heart. She also asked for a small bouquet of Scottish heather to be placed inside of her coffin, to remind her of the times in the Scottish Highlands in Balmoral. However, many of the requests made by Victoria would have caused a huge amount of upset to members of the royal family. You see, throughout her reign following the death of Prince Albert, Victoria grew close with a servant who was Scottish. He was called John Brown, and many historians have investigated their relationship, and it's believed that the pair did love each other. And Brown was a no-nonsense man who would not hide from telling the Queen something she would not like. And he was one of only a few select people who the Queen would listen to, and he served as the master of her horse, and the pair went on a lot of walks together. He even saved her from serious injury during a carriage accident, and many believe that Victoria did love Brown. Some have even claimed that the pair may have got married, but this hasn't been confirmed. They were very close, but John Brown was not the most popular with the children of Victoria, and was said to have been uncouth and too firm, but Victoria loved this about him, and after Victoria's death, Edward VII, her successor, even removed many of the memorials Victoria made to John Brown following his death. Victoria, in secret, had told her doctor that inside of her coffin she wanted placed was a lock of John Brown's hair that she had secretly kept for decades, and this was passed to the doctor, and he did this. She wanted part of her close companion with her in death, and she then also demanded a picture of Brown to be placed inside of the coffin. However, the most scandalous request that Victoria, for some reason, had the wedding rings of John Brown's mother, and she wanted this to be placed in her coffin, and this was one of the rings placed on her finger. The significance of this is that John Brown's mother may have passed the wedding rings on to Brown for him to give to a woman who would take his hand in marriage. So did Brown give the rings to the Queen with the intention of marrying her? A priest on his deathbed in Scotland claimed that he even married Queen Victoria to John Brown, but this has been disputed. But Victoria wanted to be buried with this ring. It was not a ring made of jewels like the Empress of India could have had. It was a simple ring, a ring made cheaply, but it had a huge amount of significance for Victoria. Victoria wrote about Brown's death saying, "Brown was the best, truest heart that ever beat," and she would also write that he had no thought but for me, my welfare, my comfort, my safety, my happiness, courageous, unselfish, totally disinterested, discreet to the highest degree, speaking the truth fearlessly, and telling me what he thought and considered to be just and right. Without flattery and without saying what would be pleasing if he did not think it right. The comfort of my daily life is gone. The void is terrible. The loss is irreparable. If the royal family would have found out about Dr. Reed placing this ring on her finger, they would have been furious, as they brought into question the idea of Victoria marrying Brown and casting Prince Albert in a different light. But Dr. Reed and the dresser continued to work on her body, and they then prepared her remains and placed the lid of the coffin on. Inside of the coffin were many of the Queen's most treasured items, and those who related to many of her most treasured people, including her husband, children, and possible love. Victoria's funeral was one which did not go ahead without incident, as there were a number of calamitous mistakes, including the funeral carriage even bolting off at one point, and it was then pulled by sailors. But inside of the coffin, the doctor and dresser did well, adhering to her wishes despite the chaos that was emerging outside, and they tastefully recognised what the Queen wanted, as opposed to her grandson, Kaiser Wilhelm II, who cast a death mask of her face against her wishes. These items still remain inside of Queen Victoria's coffin today.